So Tina, please come up in just a moment. Tina Rosenberg is the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, and she's a longtime New York Times writer for the editorial page, Sunday Magazine, and co-author of the Fixes column. She's written hundreds of magazine articles and 3 books. Her work has won the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award for Nonfiction, and her lightning talk is about repairing the narrative with solutions journalism. How many people in here know of solutions journalism or have done solutions journalism? Oh, amazing. This is an amazing shout out to solutions journalism. Deborah, thank you. She's always getting a plug for her solutions journalism. And it was something new to me before I met Deborah and learned about, how there's this practice, this really rigorous practice around solutions. So let's hear from Tina, and I'm going to turn this off, Wally.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
I'll hold it. So, thank you all very much, and thank you so much to Kara and Jen for that really enlightening conversation. I was really struck by it and learned a tremendous amount, and I really appreciate listening to it. So I'm going to talk about how we can solve some of the problems that people have talked about really all day today. And let me start. I'm going to base this around one newsroom, which is the Montgomery Advertiser in Alabama. And in April of 2018, the Advertiser wrote a front page editorial. You can see the front page here. The names are the names of people who were lynched. And the paper talked about, we take responsibility for our proliferation of a false narrative regarding the treatment of African Americans in those disgraceful days. This was a bold step in Montgomery, Alabama, and it made national news. It got coverage in the Washington Post and elsewhere, and bravo for them. But what they didn't realize is that what the proliferation of a false narrative regarding African Americans was not over by a long shot. And this should be familiar to everybody. We've talked about it over and over again. It's, as Kat said and found in the surveys that they did, the low-income communities of color in Montgomery were covered solely through the lens of their worst stereotype. And every marginalized community feels that this is the case. When I first went to the Advertiser, I asked them, what do you guys think of mainstream media, like the CBS, New York Times coverage of Alabama? And they all said, we hate it. I said, why? And they said, because you always make us look like ignorant yahoos. And I said, well, okay, tell me more about that. Were those stories inaccurate? And they said, no, not inaccurate. We do things that make us look like ignorant yahoos. However, we also do things that don't, and you're not interested in those. You're only interested in the former. You're just covering us through the lens of our worst stereotype, which is true and felt by every marginalized community, and people in the South feel themselves to be a marginalized community in the world of media. But what they didn't recognize was they were doing it to their city, and still are to a certain extent. They were blind to it when they were the people perpetrating it and not the victims of it. So, but in a way, we're all blind to it. I Googled Brownsville, Brooklyn, and I Googled Grand Crossing, Chicago, and this is what I came up with. I don't know if you can see it, but it's literally all crime. I think there's one story that isn't crime. There's coverage of a fire, but that was crime also. It was arson. And this is how these neighborhoods get covered. Or if we do write about something going on in low-income neighborhoods, we often get this, the white savior narrative. And it's icky. So what can we do better? The Montgomery Advertiser decided to do some solutions journalism, which probably doesn't surprise you since I'm the one telling you this story. And Bro Crift, who's a very innovative editor, he's now at the Indy Star and probably will be running not only Gannett, but the world someday, wrote an editorial that said, you spoke, we listened. You said you wanted more in-depth news and to search for solutions, and we are going to give you more solutions journalism. So they started doing pieces on the low-income communities in Montgomery and the Black community specifically that looked at what they were doing to solve their own problems. And solutions journalism is simply coverage of what people are doing to solve a problem. It is about a response to a problem and how it happens, and it's not about good intentions. It looks at available evidence of success or failure. You need some sort of evidence. It is not feel-good, inspirational. It provides insights. How was this problem solved? What happened here to make this possible where it wasn't possible elsewhere? And of course, it must cover what's not working about the response. What are the limitations? If you don't do that, you're doing public relations, and this is rigorous journalism. So one of the good things about this is, and I noticed this when Deborah was talking, this in the first panel this morning, that these stories are not broccoli. These are stories people really love to read. Your story about the church made me want to go out and read that story right now, because that really sounds lovely, and I'm sure I would learn a lot from it. I'm sure it would tell me so much about the issue, and it would be fun to read. And a lot of solutions journalism stories are like that. So they are a way to, and each of them talks about the problem, of course. They are a way to do this without the broccoli. So they started doing stories like this. So a pastor in one West Side neighborhood started buying houses and rehabbing them, employing local people to rehab them and reselling them. So he helped the housing problem, the jobs problem, and the blight problem all at once. Win, win, win. This story, and 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 this story. They started to do a lot of solutions journalism, and the effects were really dramatic. They grew the most of any Gannett paper the year they started this. They drastically improved their relationship with the Black community, which had been poor, as you might imagine, and they really rose in subscriptions as well. But the most important thing was that they were providing accurate and full coverage of their whole community. So another way of doing better comes from Trabian Shorters, who used to be a journalist. He was at the Detroit News, and then he was VP of the Knight Foundation. But now he is the head of a community he started called Be Me Community for Black Male Empowerment, and he's also on SJN's board. And we have learned a lot from him, including his method, which is called asset framing. Can I ask you if you've heard of asset framing in general? And anybody heard of Trabian's asset framing? Yes, you have a couple people. Okay, so this is very simple. Defining people by their aspirations and contributions before noting their challenges. It's the order that matters. The research on how our mind acquires new stories is pretty clear. So the answer is to, before you introduce someone's challenges, introduce them as a full person. Tell us about their assets and aspirations. They're not an at-risk youth or a justice-involved youth. They're a student. You can deal with the problems in the second graph, but let's meet them first, and let's have them associated in our brain with a narrative that is not a threat narrative. So asset framing is not trying to spin a struggle into strengths, like calling a drug dealer an entrepreneur. It is not positive language or people first language, because that is still deficit framed. It is looking at their assets. For example, take these two paragraphs, and this is from Soledad O'Brien, who's a big advocate of this. They both describe Glorious, but they're very different, and they lead the reader on a very different journey through Glorious's story. If you meet her in the second paragraph first, then you can put her challenges and struggles later. Glorious's mother is a crack addict, and her father is an alcoholic. She lives in a low-income neighborhood where 1/3 of the students in her high school drop out. That's how you should not start the story. How you should start the story is, Glorious is a B student. She's a peer leader and a starter on the Capital Preparatory Magnet School lacrosse team. So start with the student and then get into the challenges. And that is all I have today. Thank you. And yeah.